Welcome everybody to the 2025 Bundesbank Lecture at TU Dresden. I'm very delighted to have Matteo Maggiori here today. He's presenting about geoeconomics, which is really the topic of today, right? Governments put pressure on firms via tariffs, export restrictions, sanctions to achieve their policy goals. And this really distorts supply chains, threatens price stability, and therefore directly speaks to the mission of Deutsche Bundesbank. And I want to make special thanks to Deutsche Bundesbank for making this event possible. So Matteo is really one of the main protagonists in this new field of geoeconomics. He's the Mogatam Family Professor of Finance at Stanford Graduate Business School. He has research interests in international macro and finance, such as exchange rates, international portfolio investment, and the international financial architecture. He has published widely in our best journals. I don't mention all, but it's basically all the A+ journals I can imagine, plus the big finance journals. And with no further ado, I'm so happy to have you here today, Matteo, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you, Stefan, for inviting me to give this lecture. And I'm sorry that it has to be online. It's really, a great honor for me to give the Bundesbank lecture. As all Europeans, the Bundesbank is such a central institution to the economics of all of Europe. And so I'm delighted to give a lecture that they sponsored at your university. As I mentioned before, please interrupt me. Let's make this lively. Ask questions. If you have, much broader questions, you can leave them until the end. I'll make sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A, but I would be delighted to make this a lively talk. So first, let's see, immediately my clicker doesn't work. Okay, here we go. So as Stefan said, these days you don't have to motivate so much. Why do we care? I mean, quite simply, this is an activity that shapes the world very aggressively. And I used to joke that when we started this research agenda, we thought this was going to be very, very counter-cyclical. And people didn't know the topic. In fact, even the word geoeconomics wasn't obvious. One of our first papers is titled A Framework for Geoeconomics. And there were concerns among my co-authors that nobody was going to know what we were talking about. That turned out to be a good title choice, I guess. And we wake up every day now to news of this kind. Just a few days ago, the US administration sanctioned some of the oil giants of Russia. And you can see a collection of news here, many of which have to do with Europe. Europe itself faces these two big giants, the US and China, that are exerting this power, and has passed a number of legislations, including an anti-coercion framework, thinking about how do we want to shape our own economy to make sure that we can withstand foreign pressure. And certainly the episode of Germany having a dependency on energy on Russia is very lively in everybody's mind, particularly in this audience. But I want to go past the headlines, both in terms of deeper science, but also going back in history. In some sense, my initial worry about this topic is now the other way around. People are so overly focused on what we're all experiencing right now that there is a risk of thinking that geoeconomics or this exertion of pressure, it's a very recent phenomenon or might have to do with a single administration being in power in the US. But if you widen the lenses and go and look back in history, this is almost the definition of being a great power. Countries have exerted this kind of power throughout all of history. You can think of the British Empire. I'm Italian, so for me, to find an example where Italy is relevant, you have to go back to the Renaissance generally. So I generally mention the Medici Bank or something like that. But there is a lot more than what meets the eye in the recent headlines. It's a deep topic, so as Stefan mentioned, the definition that I give of it is that countries use the existing strength from their financial and trade relationships to achieve either geopolitical or economic goals. And there's a bunch of fundamental questions. When I started thinking about this, the things that were in my mind is, does this power exist? Is this a real thing? If so, what can you get out of it? In which dimensions can you exert this power? Where does it come from? How do you know which countries are powerful or what are the sources of their power? And then immediately the big question becomes, is this a zero-sum game or is it positive or potentially negative sum globally? And that I will get back to. It has to do with the idea of mercantilism that really thought of power as a zero-sum game. And today we think of that as totally the wrong idea. That power can be a positive or a negative sum game, and we have to shape the policy. I started thinking about which sectors are strategic. I mean, the word strategic gets very heavily abused in policy because if you want to get some subsidy, the first thing you do is you mention that it's in national interest for strategic reasons. Part of the reason you can is that we don't have precise definition. We don't have a definition that is clear and operable in the data that tells you which sectors are actually likely to be strategic and which are not. And then you can keep going. Like I was thinking, okay, I'm a European. If the European Commission asks, what do we do to protect ourselves? What is the rationale for policy intervention from the government? And what does optimal policy look like? So a lot of what I'm going to show you today is my own sort of imperfect answers to these questions, and how I started thinking about them systematically. So that's the plan. There's a few papers that we've been working on. This is mostly an excuse for me to call out my amazing co-authors. Everything I'm going to say today is really joint work with Chris Clayton, who's at Yale, Jesse Schrager, who is at Columbia, and Antonio Coppola, who's here at Stanford GSB with me. So if you want to look at the details of what I'm going to touch on today, you can go and find the papers. And in the slides, I will put them at the bottom so that if you want to go and look deeper into the material, it tells you where you're most likely to find it. But much more important than our own work, there's a button there with a reading list, and at the end there's a long set of slides with readings. Because I'm going to argue in a second that economists are unfamiliar with a lot of the work on this that comes, for example, from political science. So I had to do a lot of that reading myself, and you can at least get the abbreviated version of what I found useful or what I thought other economists might find useful. So hopefully those slides are of general interest. Now, let me start exactly with that. So my first complaint about economists is that we have reduced the notion of power to largely just mean market power, the ability to sell at a markup. But when we think of a large sovereign or a big firm like Google or the US government being powerful, we really mean something that is much broader than market power. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was think about a concept of geoeconomic power. And fortunately, there are some very important concepts in political science about this. So one that I like a lot is from Robert Dahl in 1957, and it's pretty straightforward. It says A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would otherwise not want to do. Okay, and today you're going to see my formal rendition of a statement that has a lot to do with that. That's what political scientists tend to think of as relational power. Okay, so an actor like a government influences another one to get an action. But then there is something deeper and perhaps more interesting that another political science, Strange, has been sort of pushing among others. Here I'm clearly oversimplifying the literature, is the idea that an actor, particularly a big one like a government, is influencing an entire economic environment. You can think of it as setting up the rules of the game or coordinating into a particular equilibrium. Today, I will give you my rendition of that, which is going to have to do with manipulating general equilibrium externalities in a particular direction. Now, the political scientists themselves recognize that these definitions are somewhat fuzzy. And here you can see a statement saying, look, this is just like a very hard topic. And I think one of the things that we try to have as economists is very, very precise definition of what we mean that are formal and that hopefully also can bring us closer to the data, to being able to do policy counterfactuals. So that's where we came from. Now, particularly in Germany, I want to mention a fantastic book that most economists don't know or don't remember until recent years, which is actually written by a German refugee. Hirschman writes a book in 1945, so this is after he escaped Europe because of Nazi persecution. And he comes to Berkeley and he writes a book called National Power and the Structure of Foreign Trade that actually had to do with his views of Germany using in the build-up to World War II, its economic and financial linkages to shape Europe in its favor, looking at a future possible war. And it's an important book. And I'm going to touch on a lot of the concepts from this book today. First, because he has a very deep distaste for mercantilism. So even in 45, it was clear to him that geoeconomic power doesn't mean mercantilism. It's not the idea that there is a fixed set of resources and we're bargaining. So if I have power over Stefan, he cannot have power over me. He was already thinking as an economist of, look, as we exert this power, the total pie is either increasing or shrinking, and then it's about how we divide it. But similarly, he had a distaste for the simplistic, at least, rendition of Adam Smith, where the issues of plenty, the size of the pie, are always best dealt with without ever thinking about power, because somehow the invisible hand will take care of this. So he was really phrasing it in the middle and thinking about power imbalances. Now, this book is largely forgotten. I'll make it precise in a second. The reason why we remember it today, it's mostly because of an index. So the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which it's largely used in IO, comes from that book. It has lost totally the connotation of measuring the power of countries. It's largely used to measure the power of firms in market power, which speaks to my earlier complaint that we've reduced everything to be firm market power. But this originally comes from measuring economic dependency in trade. Now, when I say this has been forgotten, just for fun, in a macro annual, we pulled out all of the Google Scholar citations of this book, and we had the arrays classified them as whether the book was being cited in economics or in political science. And you can see that, he writes the book in 45 as he was a young trade economist trying to get a job at Berkeley. By the way, he failed to get the job at Berkeley, but he was speaking to economists. And even in the early 60s, most of the citations on these books were in economics. And then we kind of forgot about this. And a huge field opens up called international political economy in political science that thinks of these as one of the foundational texts. And so we kind of lost a little bit of the plot of these issues. Our friends in political science have done a lot of thinking about this. And part of what we want to do is get back to it in economics. We have complementary skills. We tend to think much harder about formal thinking and formal models, bringing it to a data. Can you do counterfactuals? So there's a lot of complementarity. And so hopefully, if this agenda is successful, when we update this graph, 15 years from now, that red line will be sort of coming up. We'll see about that. Now, I'm going to do one informal set of slides just to tell you how I really think about this. And then we're going to go to an actual model and data. So a lot of our time was spent thinking about how should an economist model geoeconomics. That was totally unclear because a lot of what exists is long essays, like it's very discursive. So we ended up making a participation constraint crucial in thinking formally about power. So here I'm going to do it first informally with an example, and then we'll do a formal model. So let's start thinking about a European firm, ASML. This is a firm in the Netherlands, has been in the news a lot. It produces lithography machines that are essential in the production of semiconductors. It has US suppliers, and it sells these machines all over the world, including before the recent actions to China. So let's just think of the value function of this firm privately in partial equilibrium. It takes as given an aggregate set of variables Z. Those might be all the prices, all of the aggregate demand factors, everything in a general equilibrium sense. And it makes its private optimal decisions. A vector of choice is X star, how much to produce, where to source, where to sell, at which prices, all of the typical stuff. Now let's think of the US government. It wants to get an action out of this firm. So you can think of the Robert Dahl definition. I want to get ASML not to sell these lithography machines to China. That's a privately costly action for the firm. So that satisfies the definition of they wouldn't otherwise want to do it. I'm asking them to deviate from their private optimum. And it's also an action that I cannot impose. This is a foreign firm. I don't have the usual recourse. This isn't NVIDIA. If I'm the US government, I can't tax the firm. I can't regulate them. I cannot put export controls. I need to get them to comply. Now, one thing that you can do is you can threaten them. So you can see that the value function shifts to the left. I might use a theta lower bar that says, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to make your life miserable. In the particular context of ASML, allegedly the threat was the imposition of what is called the foreign direct product rule. This is a little known, or until recently, legislation of the US that was created during the Cold War that essentially prevents firms around the world to do some activities as long as they're using some components that are coming from the US. And if you violate it, you might be sanctioned yourself as a firm. You might, for example, be added to the entity list. So it's a very, very serious threat. And so the US says, look, don't do what I say. We're going to put an FPDR on you. Keep going. We're going to put you on the entity list. So that moves the value function way to the left. What I'm asking you is to take a set of costly actions. So the formal rendition of I'm asking you to do something that you would otherwise not do is I'm asking you to take on board a set of wedges, tau, in your first order conditions that alter what you're going to do. Now that turns out to be these two very simple intuitions turn out to be central to almost all of our theoretical work. Why? Because they give you two things. First, they give you a very simple definition of power, which I'm going to expand on in a second, which tells you that at a very basic level, you're going to accept whenever the set of costly actions I'm asking you to take are better, you're better off with those costly actions than with the outside option, which is being punished by me. Now, you can make this much more complicated, and we will, with repeated games, with thinking about which punishments are sustainable, can I do positive inducements? But once you have the logic of it's all about this participation constraint, now a lot of economic theory falls into place. Similarly, once you start thinking that the right way to model power is in a generic sense, a set of first wedges in first order conditions, now, all of a sudden, markups, tariffs, export controls are all a rendition of those taus. In fact, we know that they're very tractable because if you're a macro theory or a public finance theorist, those are exactly the wedges that we use all the time to do general equilibrium theory. And so once you have these two elements as slot in, a lot of economic theory can be brought to bear on these questions. And so what I'm going to do, it's go there. Okay? In essentially after this slide, we start the model. But before I go into the details, I want to sort of go back to the concepts of power. Immediately, you can see, even with just this basic logic, two very useful concepts. One that we called micropower, which is go back to ASML, take as given the entire world, and imagine the private cost calculation that ASML does in accepting or rejecting the imposition of some costly action from a foreign actor. It's going to look at taking as given Z, the maximum private cost. Now, in this sense, a sector is strategic if it lets the hegemon do one or two things, either form valuable threats on other sectors, or if there are actions that he can extract from it that he finds very valuable given the equilibrium. But then you can think about a different concept, which is macro-strategic. If I'm the US, I am exerting power not just over ASML, but over many, many firms in the semiconductor chain. What I'm thinking about is that when I ask them to do costly actions, I'm going to change a general equilibrium through potentially many channels, through input-output matrices. So the semiconductors will amplify through sectors that are potentially very far downstream, through prices, for example, the terms of trade, or through economies of scale and specialization, through externalities. So the benefit to me is the social value to the hegemon of the private actions that I get everybody else to take. Now you can see that there is a big disconnect. Every firm in accepting, or a small country in accepting or rejecting these demands is looking at micropower, is looking at the private values. But the hegemon is potentially shifting an entire equilibrium in its favor, which goes back to those concepts that I mentioned from political science, or thinking about setting up the rules of the game or manipulating an entire equilibrium. Here we can make it very formal by thinking through general equilibrium theory and a potentially large player that takes derivatives over equilibrium objects. Okay? So that's pretty much it in terms of like deep down, what we're going to learn from theory. It's a lot of applications of these basic concepts. But since they're probably mysterious still at this level, I'm going to jump into a specific model so that you can see them building from the micro foundations up. So let me start with it, okay? And please interrupt me if there are any questions. So I'm going to make it as simple as I can. I'm going to have n countries, and I'm going to have a set of productive sectors, I, and a set of local factors. So think of productive sectors as an activity in a country. For example, American oil and Russian oil are two different sectors. Their output might be almost close to perfect substitutes in production, but a sector is an activity located in a country. And think of the factors as, for example, local resources or local labor. Okay, they're international immobile. Each sector has a unit mass of firms. What do? They essentially produce with a decreasing returns to scale technology using two things, the local factors and intermediate inputs. So Xij is what sector I uses a sector J output as an input. Okay, so there's a whole input-output matrix in there. And the only thing that is special about this production function is I'm going to have Z, a set of aggregate quantities that potentially the production function depends on. So if you're familiar with Greenwald-Stiglitz, this is a very cheap way to get externalities. So let's immediately do two examples so that we see them. Think of an external economy of scale. Z is the total size of the sector. The bigger the total size of the sector, the more each firm is productive. Think of a strategic complementarity in inputs. Z is the vector of everybody else usage of the same input. That input is more productive for me, the more everybody else uses it. A typical example is a payment system. You want to be on Swift because everybody else is on the same system. So it's more productive for you to use it, the more everybody else is using it. Okay? So it's going to be very reduced form, but very flexible, and it's going to let us take care of the externalities. And each country is going to have a representative consumer. So the consumer is, I'm going to keep it as straightforward as possible. He has a utility function over a vector of consumption. So those are all the goods around the world, potentially. And I'm not going to use it for today, but you could imagine plugging in there some ad hoc assumptions about things that this consumer likes or doesn't like a government objective of I don't like another country having a big military sector, or I care about the distance between my AI and yours. Like that's totally reduced form. It's only useful in terms of it's still helpful to see what it does to policy, but for today, I'm not going to play around with it. And the budget constraint is very straightforward. On the right-hand side, I have resources. It's a static model. So what do I have? I have factor income, and I have the profits of my domestic firms. So here I'm assuming that each country owns its own firms. Okay, there's going to be big incentives in this model to do FDI. I'm not going to do endogenous FDI for today. On the left-hand side, I have my consumption plan, what I spend on consumption. So this one indirectly defines, optimal consumption plans given prices and wealth. Wealth is the right-hand side of the constraint, WN. That gives me an indirect utility, and that's going to be my objective function logic. Each government is going to try to maximize the indirect utility of his own consumer. And so you can see that if I activate the UN of Z, I get some other government objectives that I can play around with. Markets have to clear. So every good that gets produced either gets absorbed by consumption or by an intermediate input producers, and the local factor market has to clear. That's it. The structure of the real economy, that's all we need. It's some reason why the world is connected to each other, and clearly input-output amplification and externalities I'm going to play around with, but it's a very, very simple basic input-output matrix, okay? The interesting part that I'm going to play around with is on the government action. I'm going to have an offense and a defense so that we can think about coercion and we can think about anti-coercion. So let's do it by backward induction. At the end, production and consumption, just as I described, take place. In the middle, it's the offense period. So I'm going to pick a country in the model exogenously. I'm not going to think about why that country to be the hegemon. In what way is the hegemon special? It's special because it can make threats. The particular threats that I'm going to study for today is very simple. It's the threat that if you don't do what I say, you lose access to inputs that I control. Okay, so you can think of it as if you don't do what I say, you don't get access to Swift, or you don't get access to semiconductors, or if I'm China, you don't get access to rare earths. So it's a threat not to sell you some stuff. And then we can think about other threats. What do I demand you? I demand you a set of costly actions that we've already previewed. They're going to be wedges in first order conditions. I'm essentially asking you to alter your actions. But here, I have very fine controls on you. This might be, I'm asking you to sell less to a particular other sector around the world. Or I might ask you for just transfers. Okay, you can think of transfers are literally like a shakedown, which again, when we started this agenda, people found it very unappealing because which governments ask you for transfers and shakedowns? These days, probably it's a more reasonable assumption. But you can also think of it as, for example, I'm asking you for a political action, and that tau is your private cost of the action. Okay, you can relabel it pretty easily. I'm going to make bargaining very simple. The hegemon has all the power, makes it take it or leave it offers. Okay, so the rest of the world simply does accept or reject. That's the offense. So a lot of our earlier work was all about this middle period. It was all of characterizing what is the optimal offense. Today, I'm going to add an ex ante stage, which is very interesting, for example, in the context of Europe. I'm going to think about a moment ex ante where every government is choosing a set of wedges, a set of complete policies on its domestic firms. So the hegemon is special because later it's going to bully everybody has a relationship with around the world. But every country can do domestic policy. And this complete set of wedges look like tax policy, industrial policy, tariffs, like trade policy. What are they really doing is they're taking a set of policy actions ex ante to shape up their economies to withstand being bullied later. And so that's going to be our anti-coercion policy. It's going to be the part of these wedges that is aiming to decrease the effect of the hegemon later on. There are going to be many other reasons to do policy that have nothing to do with this, and we're going to allow them. But the part that we're going to label anti-coercion is thinking about what you want to do ex ante to be able not to be overly reliant on this foreign hegemon later. Okay, so that's the setup. That's the part that is interesting of this game. I said that the participation constraint was crucial, so let me show you what it looks like in a fully specified model. So when the hegemon in the middle is approaching a foreign sector to bully them, they're comparing two things. Given the nature of the threats that we're studying, the firm's inside option, which is the middle part of that graph, is to accept the hegemon demands, produce by facing not only the domestic wedges, but also the ones imposed by the hegemon, and potentially pay transfers. So that's the inside option. What is the outside option? Is produce without ever accepting the wedges imposed by the hegemon, but potentially with a reduced set, JIO, of inputs. So JI is the full set of inputs that you have access to. JIO is the reduced set of inputs that you have access after you reject the contract and the hegemon shuts you down. For example, in the case of ASML, you could imagine a world where ASML loses access to any inputs coming from the US if it doesn't comply with the request. Now, implicitly, again, when you model, you have to make choices. So two that are very important to understand in this context are what we're allowing and not allowing, and what is the sense in which the policies are ex ante. So first, let me talk about the allowing and not allowing. We wanted a model of a business cycle kind of frequency. So if I wanted a model that was super short run, I would have said, when you cut me off, when Stefan says you can no longer use the inputs that I produce, I can't rearrange anything else. I have to produce with all of the other choices stuck without yours. This is not this model. This model allows you to rebalance. When Stefan cuts me off, I can rearrange all of my other relationships. For example, if somebody else in the audience is a very close substitute for Stefan, I will immediately move my orders to him. And through the power of substitution, Stefan is going to have very little power on me. Right? I'm largely indifferent when he cuts me off because I can find a perfect substitute. What we're not allowing here is very, very long run things. Like, for example, all of the equilibrium to change here. When you kick out a firm, the equilibrium stays the same. So that's why I think of it as medium run. Similarly, what does it mean for the policies of the governments to be ex ante? It means that they're not adjusted on the equilibrium and off the equilibrium path. I think of it as you do a set of industrial policies. It takes a little bit of time for the sectors to reshape. Whether when the hegemon threatens you, the size of those sectors is given, whether they accept or reject. Okay, so that's going to be important. That's the sense in which they're ex ante policy. We wanted to avoid a world where I start promising crazy things if you reject the contract, huge subsidies, because then clearly I can manipulate the equilibrium a little bit through it. Okay, that's it. That's the plan. The objective functions, I'm going to largely skip them. They are what I told you they are. Each country maximizes the consumer welfare, potentially including these extra political objectives, but don't focus on them. The hegemon maximizes the consumer welfare of his own country. The only thing that is relevant is if you look at the hegemon wealth, it includes the transfers he gets from the rest of the world. Okay, so that's the only extra part. Okay, so let's take this for a spin. Okay, I'm going to solve it in closed form. And to solve it in closed form, I'm going to simplify even further. I'm going to do two things. The first is I'm going to assume constant prices. So I'm going to make consumers have linear utility. So prices are not moving around in equilibrium. It totally kills the incentives of the hegemon to manipulate the terms of trade. And so I'm going to make everything come through the production externalities, which I like a lot more. So I'm going to focus on that. If you want to see the terms of trade, you can look at the papers. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to focus on the political objectives. Okay, I'm also going to go to a very concrete example so that rather than a generic input-output matrix, we can see one that looks like something that we care about in the data. So I'm going to take the structure that we just went through, and I'm going to narrow it down to a simple example. I'm going to say the hegemon has a simple sector. It has only bankers that produce financial services. So in New York or in San Francisco, somebody's producing financial services and they're being sold to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is a collection of small open economies, and each economy is identical. What do they have? They have an intermediary, the blue circle with an eye, that can use the foreign financial services or the domestic ones, slap them together, and produce a composite financial service that then he sells to a manufacturing sector D. Okay? The only things that I need to play around are the strategic complementarities and the economies of scale. So I'm going to assume, very much like in reality, that the global financial services sold by the hegemon are more attractive and more productive for everybody else, the more everybody else uses them. So again, the example is Swift or a custody system. It's like a social media. You want to be on Swift because everybody else is on Swift. And so it's efficient to send each other's messages for transferring money. The domestic external sector has a local external economy of scale. It's essentially saying, look, if you want to have a local payment system, like a domestic one, you kind of have to scale it up. The bigger it is, the more productive it is. The typical example, which I will return to, was Russia immediately after the early invasion of Crimea in 2014. One of the things that they did, perhaps in anticipation of future sanctions, is they massively scale up their domestic payment system to make it more efficient, thinking that they were going to potentially lose access to the foreign ones. That's a structure. Now, to get close forms, I'm going to make it CES, which is familiar to all of you. And the only sector that really is interesting is the intermediary. So what is that intermediary in blue doing? He's taking X, I, and J, which is the services he can buy from the hegemon, and X, I, and H, which is the services he can buy from the domestic producer. It's combining them with a CES. And where did I embed the externalities, the Zs? I embedded them into the productivities. So you can see that the green one, which is the global one, says that particular foreign input is more productive for me the more everybody else is using it. So Z equals X in equilibrium when markets clear, but I take that Z as given, and the parameter of the externality is the Xij. The higher Xij, the more I have an externality. The local economy of scale is in red. It simply says the local factor is more productive the more it's being used. Okay, that's all. That's the rendition of the paper. Now let's see what happens in this model. Okay, and to make it more intuitive, let me start with first, forget the hegemon, forget all of the policy structure, take the economy as is, and let's do the two standard benchmark of international macro. So first, one very obvious benchmark that we generally use is a global planner. You take all of the economies as they are, you forget the policy game, and you say there's a global planner that can set a complete set of wedges on every activity in the economy. What would the global planner solution look like? It's very intuitive. It will subsidize both the global services, the global financial technology, and the domestic ones, both in terms in proportion to how strong their externalities are. It's a planner. It sees that there are positive externalities in production, and it scales up both activities up to the efficient level. Okay, that's pretty standard. Suppose that we go to the other typical benchmark of international macro, remove the global planner, remove the hegemon, everybody sets wedges ex ante on their domestic economies, playing a Nash game. So they take as given everybody else wedges, they set their own. Okay, what do you get in the Nash game? Both outcomes are obvious. The one on the right-hand side, on the home alternative system, you're a government, you fully internalize every domestic externality that has no international spillovers. So you scale that activity up to the efficient level, just like the global planner would do. The part on the hegemon finance, it's also intuitive. I have a collection of small open economies. One of the standard results of Nash games in this context is that you don't internalize any externalities that occur across countries. You think you're too small. In this particular case, since it's only across countries, each country decides neither to tax or subsidize the hegemon system because they just don't see any particular externality. And so you get under provision of subsidy at the global level. So keep in mind these two benchmarks, and let's see what happens when you have a hegemon and anti-coercion policy. So first, go back to our participation constraint, okay? I promise you that this was crucial, so let's see it in action. Think about this model. Each intermediary around the world is facing a constant marginal revenue curve because I set prices to be constant in equilibrium with linear consumer preferences. But because it has decreasing returns to scale for a given level of externalities, it has an increasing marginal cost curve. So the typical result that we're all familiar with is that the value of the firm unencumbered would have been the area between the price, the marginal revenue curve, and the marginal cost curve. Now let's think about what happens with the hegemon. If the hegemon cuts you off, weakly speaking, the marginal cost curve shifts to the left. You're producing with fewer inputs, you're generally less efficient. We don't know by how much, but certainly weakly less efficient. The marginal cost curve shifts. What the hegemon can extract, power in a micro sense, is the difference between the outside option and the inside option. So you can see that the red area is what the hegemon can extract as a transfer. The left blue area is the outside option. And this is crucial because it tells you that there is a fundamental conflict between the hegemon and the firms or the governments that are being bullied. The hegemon cares about a difference, the difference between the inside and the outside option. The rest of the world cares about a level, the level of the outside option. And that's going to create all of the problem. You could think, for example, of a world which we will formalize in a second, in which as a hegemon, I'm perfectly happy to move into a situation where the inside options are coming down. So I'm moving away from the globally efficient frontier. as long as the outside options are coming down even faster. I only care about the difference of the two. The planner cares about a level. So we're going to make this formal and think of it exactly now. So what does the hegemon do as an offense? So in the middle period, when he bullies you, what does he ask? The first one is he asks you to use more of his own system. Now, in some sense, that's pretty similar to what the planner would have said. I want you to scale up how much you use my system because you don't see the externalities, but I do. I see that as a hegemon, that whenever you use my payment system, everybody else also wants to use it, and the system is becoming more valuable. But what's very different from the planner is that I ask you to stop using your own system. The first thing I do is I tell you, if you don't want to be cut off from my system, I'm asking you not to use the alternative. So that should remind you of, for example, President Trump threatening the BRICS that if they ever start an alternative payment system, they're going to be subject to huge tariffs or be totally disconnected by the US-centric ones. Is I'm trying to kill the alternative. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to over-globalize the economy. I'm trying to make the economy even more integrated than the planner would have liked, as long as all of the integration makes me centered. It's all based on me, and hence I can use it ex post to exert power. So you can see that this is like over financial globalization from this perspective. Now go back to the picture and think about, okay, every government understands that this is what's coming later. What do they want to do ahead of time? What anti-coercion policy do they want to put in place? And it's pretty intuitive. In this basic setup, what each government is trying to do is to shape up its own economy to have a better outside option, because that one is going to help you sustain bargain. Like if you're involved in policy now in Europe, this will be phrased as you're trying to reduce an unwanted dependency on a foreign hegemon. You're trying to scale up your access to alternatives so that when you get bullied, your outside options aren't so bad. How do you do it, and what comes out? So in this particular simple example, the outcome is extreme. The outcome is you fully ban the usage of the foreign hegemon inputs, and you fully subsidize the domestic one. Now, there is nothing generic about this outcome, and I will show you in a second why I wanted it, is it generates full fragmentation. Here, you completely ban globalization, and you become very secure by scaling up the domestic alternative. In general, in the paper, if you remove the crazy analytical assumptions, what you get is a trade-off. You try to reduce reliance at the expense of the gains from trade, which I'm going to return to in a second. So you can see that the outcome changes quite substantially on exactly who has power and when it gets exerted and how. And before I move to the data, I want to sort of take everything we've done and leave you with some thoughts that come out of our theories. And again, there's a lot more in the papers. But the first, to me, is probably the first two are quite connected and the most important. So if you think about how we explain the gains from trade, we think about specialization, we think about external economies of scale. Hidden in those arguments, the same sources of the gains from trade also generate economic dependency. Because if Stefan and I decide that we're all going to specialize in something different and trade ex post, that can be very efficient, except if Stefan can hold me up. Because the things that I didn't specialize in are now a very poor substitute for what Stefan is specialized in and is very productive. And so all of a sudden he has a lot of power over me. So the trade-off between economic security and gains from trade is not an accidental one. It's a very deep one in the sense that the same mechanism generate both the gains from trade and dependency. And so we ended up calling this effect a Krugman meets geoeconomics, because facing a coercive global hegemon, countries want to specialize less. They want to unwind some of globalization and choose a different point on the frontier in terms of how much they specialize or scale up. In the model I just showed you, this tells you that Nash policy in this sense, each country choosing how much to unwind globalization, it's inefficient. Why? Because you can get something that we call the fragmentation doom loop. As each country decides that it wants to be more secure, they're making the global systems less attractive. Everybody else is also moving away, and we feed on each other. So we're kicking, in some sense, the same positive feedback loop that generated globalization. We kick it in reverse. You can think of it as Italy decides that they would like to have a steel plant because they don't want to be dependent on foreign steel, but they don't internalize that so did France and Germany. And they could have, each one of them didn't have to have a steel plant. It was enough to have one country do it, and it might be efficient to have the European Commission sort of coordinate economic security policy. It also tells you a big lesson for the US right now. Think of the simple model I just gave you. The hegemon has all the power, and yet in equilibrium, it has no power at all. Right? I showed you an outcome where each country is so afraid of getting bullied and gets so little exposed if it gets bullied that it decides to move completely away from the hegemon. Once he moves completely away from the hegemon, in equilibrium, the hegemon has no power at all. So it's simply a commitment issue that if I threaten you with bullying you all the time, I am unwinding some of my own power because you want to move away from me. And it gives you a very different view, which we develop in one of the papers, of international organizations. This has changed my mind as an economist enormously over the last 2 years. I always thought that if I had to model international organizations like the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, I would have modeled them as an incarnation of a global plan. And then I would have thought about how does the game sustain that outcome. Instead, now I've come to think of them as a self-serving deal of the hegemon. This is the hegemon telling you, look, you don't have to be scared of me. I'm going to commit to a set of rules where I limit how much I'm going to bully you exposed. Why do I want to do it? Because it makes you relaxed. It attracts you into my economic network. And actually in equilibrium, it helps me maintain some power. It's a different perspective. It's also an important one for policy because I believe in the US, with the general public has come to the conclusion that all of these rules of the game are in the interest of the other countries. And we should remember that that's not the case. They're in the interest of the hegemon itself because it prevents every other country to be so afraid that they don't want to deal with you. And so I don't think that these things are innocuous at all as models or as economic forces. Nonetheless, in the rest of the talk, I want to focus entirely on data. And I'm going to focus on two approaches. One that many of you, I believe, know a lot about, which is a sufficient statistics approach. If you're a trade economist, a lot of this is going to be sort of familiar to you as a technology. And then another approach that I believe is unfamiliar to all of us, including myself, which is using artificial intelligence to measure some of these things. And I'll tell you, I'm experimenting with these things, and I'll tell you what I've learned and what I know. Okay, so let me start with the one that we're familiar. Think of the general model that we just did, and rather than parameterizing it with a very simple form to get close forms, let's just use nested CS. And if you're a trade economist, it's pretty straightforward, right? You start at the bottom. So for each industry, you have a set of foreign varieties that you can buy, and they go into a CS basket. Then for that industry, you mix the foreign varieties, that's number 3, with the domestic variety. Okay, that's a little similar to what we just did. That's another CS basket. And then you have in number 2, you start aggregating into the production function different industries. And in number 4, I'm going to bring in financial services and all of the rest of manufacturing. Okay? The structure is not essential, but it makes it concrete. If you're a trade economist, it should be relatively straightforward to you that one way to measure power, one way to measure what would happen to you if you lose access to a subset of inputs, it's a slightly more sophisticated version of the calculation that we do to say what are the costs of autarky. I mean, what is autarky is losing access to all goods that are imported and exported. But here you're losing a subset, but a lot of the same technology works. In particular, why do I call it a sufficient statistic approach? Because very much building on the work of people like Konstantinos Arkolakis and co-authors, you can think of it as I take a few elements that are observed on the equilibrium path, in particular the expenditure shares and some elasticities, and I use the structure of the model to compute a counterfactual, which would have been the value if you lost access to some inputs, but I don't have to recompute the entire model. Okay, so the calculation that I have here tells you that the power I have over these foreign producers is given by what? If you look at the little parenthesis, 1 over little omega, that's a fraction of that sector that the hegemon controls. In some sense, it's telling you what is the expenditure share on the goods that you're going to lose. Then the slightly bigger omegas, the omega IGR, tells you what in that sector, what fraction was being spent on foreign varieties versus domestic. That's very important, right? Think about it. What is the first alternative when a foreign government cuts you off? Is a domestic producer. I mean, you can go among the foreign varieties or you can go to the domestic one. So China right now is trying to scale up semiconductors a lot. Why? Because it's being lost on access to a foreign variety, the semiconductors of the US. And then the rest are essentially how big are these sectors in the economy. Okay, so the beauty, what I like about these formulas is that the stuff in red, the shares, even with all the limitations of input-output tables, trade data, and all of that, you can measure in the data. The blue elements are parameters, they're elasticities. Now, those are very hard to estimate. There's a long trade literature trying to estimate elasticities. Estimates vary enormously. We're just going to simply take them for a spin. Okay, I'm not going to take a stand on particular elasticities. In fact, in the paper, we give you full robustness checks, but they help you structure the ideas. It also brings up something crucial, which is the nonlinearity of power, which I'm going to talk a lot about in the remaining part of the talk. Just focus on the inner basket, okay, the basket of the foreign varieties. When does Stefan have a lot of power over me? Well, that simple equation at the top tells you that there are two conditions. One is a lot of what I was buying was coming from him. That's the omega. When omega is very close to 1, 100% of what I was buying in this sector was coming from Stefan. If he cuts me off, that's going to be very bad for me. I need to reallocate my entire expenditure to a potentially a very, very small set of producers. The other one that is familiar again to all economists is the elasticity of substitution. The closer we get to Cobb-Douglas, the closer that sigma is to 1, the more we get enormous gains from trade or enormous losses from losing access to any one variety. Why? Because at 1, we're in Cobb-Douglas. If I lose one variety, I can't produce anything in that basket. Okay, so that's a typical power of the elasticity of substitution. But I'm going to argue that if you look at the data, the omegas are quite telling. In particular, here I computed them for a US coalition, which includes Western Europe, the UK, Australia, Japan. I mean, that coalition might be changing, but when we wrote this paper, that seemed an appropriate coalition. And the Chinese coalition includes, I think, Russia, Hong Kong, and Macau. And Belarus, I think, but doesn't matter very much. What these graphs are is take at each sector level all of the bilateral trade shares, so compute those little omegas for all countries around the world, and then this is a kernel smoothed density. So it's like a histogram, it's like a frequency. So let's start on the right. The first thing is when we say that China is a big manufacturing country, what we really mean is that in many countries and in many sectors in manufacturing, the import penetration share of coming from China, it's very high. It's 20, 30%. I mean, for a single country exporter, that's a huge number. You can see that in financial services, of course, is nothing. China is not a big player. When you look at the Western coalition, what really stands out is finance. The thing that the Western countries really control is basic financial services, payments, custody, the ability to settle, all of that. If you cannot get it from a Western control system, you're left with very, very little. And so you can see that the green line on the left graph, it's very close to 80, 90, 95%. That's where those nonlinearities really kick in. You're leaving me with no alternative. On top, if I have to believe that any sector has very, very low elasticity of substitutions, I will probably pick basic financial services. I mean, there is essentially only very poor substitutes for Swift or for the ability to custody access, to the ability to transact in Western financial markets. That's what we're going to exploit. So if you do those calculations, what comes out are if the American coalition were to cut you off for various destination countries, how much of your value added is being lost? And then we split it by coming from all goods and services and finance separately. And the message that we've been sort of giving is I wouldn't take any one of these number like too seriously. Again, they depend on elasticities and things that we have relatively low confidence in as economists. But it's starting to tell you that one thing that jumps out is how much of the West power comes from finance. Compared to China, where it all comes from manufacturing, except Singapore, because it's an offshore financial center. It also tells you something interesting about anti-coercion. If most of the power comes from sectors that have very, very dominant shares, high little omegas, and very low sigmas, anti-coercion doesn't mean I need to go and diversify everything to 50-50 shares. It's just enough to move away from the corners to generate a lot of economic security without fragmenting a ton of the global economy. And so for anti-coercion, it's a crucial message, which I'm going to return to when we do AI. It also tells you that a very frequent policy mistake in the US is when we assess what's going to happen if China builds an alternative payment system. The statement that you hear all the time is, look, even 10 years from now, the dollar is going to be super central. Yes, maybe China's currently somewhere like 3% of the transactions, let's say. We're not going to be 50-50. But, it's not that unlikely that China might be 6, 7, 10% of that market, and the US will still be in the high 50s. That scenario is taken with a lot of reassurance. It looks great. You're still going to be more than 50% of the market, and look, China's going to go from 3 to 10. Now, from a macroeconomic perspective, that's correct. If I think of the usual things like the transmission of monetary policy, how exchange rates work, all of that stuff, I agree with that sentiment. But in the power space for geoeconomics, that's an epic disaster. Why? Because think about China being 10% of the world payment system. All of a sudden, the West's ability to sanction Russia financially has gone to trivial amounts. Why? Because if China was 10% of the world system, that would be a perfectly fine alternative for Russia to switch to. And so you really have to think of power is all about these concentrations that are very nonlinear. Going from being 95% of the market to 85, it's a lot worse than going from 85 to 75 or 75 to 65. And so it gives you a very different view of how to interpret the data. And it's one that is not reassuring compared to the typical narrative of the dollar will always be central. Yes, but nothing guarantees that you will be that overwhelming. And it's really the dominant position that matters. Okay, in the last part of the talk, let me switch to artificial intelligence, which has been fun. So one of the things that we wanted to think about is, okay, there's this application of pressure. Remember the ASLM example. I might be asking you things that go into many dimensions. The firms are reacting. How do we keep track on this? And one thing that was obvious to us is that threats are off the equilibrium path. A lot of the most powerful threats never get realized. ASML did not get sanctioned. If I tell a European bank, stop trading with Iran, or you cannot clear your trades in the US, they're going to stop trading with Iran, but I'm never going to see the threat being realized. And then we thought about, okay, one fun thing to do is to take all of the firm level text that exists in economics. For example, Tarek Hassan has done a lot of this work with earning calls, or you can do it with analyst reports, and think about what are the firms saying? Are they being pressured? If they're being pressured, what are they being asked to do, and how are they reacting? Now, until a few years ago, this was a non-starter because for something this size, simple, array time or simply having, some natural language processes that looks for a few keywords gives you too rough of an answer. But with the advances of large language models in recent years, make a lot of this more possible with some drawbacks, which I'll talk about. But we were curious to take them for a spin. So think about what we're doing. Collect, right now, probably that number is no longer in the 790s, closer to 1 million. Collect all earning calls of publicly listed firms around the world, including the Chinese firms, because that data exists. Take analyst reports that talk about these firms. Collect all of the corporate level text. And now write prompts. So what is a prompt? If you're not familiar with this, think of writing the instructions you would have written to your arrays that say, read this document and fill in this questionnaire that potentially has, in our case, 55 fields. Is the firm being affected by export controls? Which country is imposing the export controls? Which country is being targeted by the controls? Is it affecting the firm inputs, what they buy, or the firm products, what they sell? How are they reacting? Are they increasing investment? Are they decreasing it? Are they increasing prices? Are they adjusting supply chains? And we're going to ask them where and how. Then we're going to ask, does it affect their quantities? Does it affect their profit margin? Think of like transforming essentially that text in a data set with 55 fields that are the basic things that you would want to know about this action. In the middle, you have an LLM. It's nothing else than a black box that is potentially extremely complex that transforms that text into that structured data. Okay? What are we doing in practice? We're using open weights models that are frontier models like Llama, Gemma, or GLM that these big AI companies make available. So this isn't sending something over an API. Like if you're interested in these things, a lot of our investment has been on best practices. These are totally sitting on our computer, on our supercomputer. They cannot be changed. We have the model, and they're replicable in the narrow sense that we make them totally deterministic. If I ask the same thing with the same text 50 times, it's going to give me 50 identical answers. So they don't have the typical stochasticity of every time I press the button and run the code, something changes. And there's a lot that goes into those details that I'm not going to get into. But let's go back to our initial example. So I had ASML, it's this firm that produces lithography. I have US suppliers and Chinese customers, and the government is pressuring them. I get text from the US firms, I get text from ASML itself, I get text from its Chinese customers like SMIC. What comes out of that text? Well, first, that the countries imposing the controls are the US and Netherlands, the recipient is China, the firm products are EUV and DUV systems. These are essentially the extreme lithography machines. The impact on the firm, ASML, is negative. Why? Well, lower sales to China. They're complying. They lost the market. But then we can go to the Chinese firm and say, okay, you lost access to this input. Is it affecting you? What are you doing in response? And so what I'm going to show you is the characterization of this. So at a high level, just as a sanity check, here's the fraction of firms that talk about sanctions and who they say is the person imposing the sanction and against whom. So the two big spike in 14 and 22 are obvious. Those are the sanctions on Russia. The one in the middle in 18, you probably remember it. It's really two things. It's the US sanctions on Huawei and ZTE. Those are the telecommunication giants of China, and the US sanctions on Iran, which also involve Europe. If you look at trade and do tariffs, the two Trump administration clearly stand out. Every firm, like 50% of the firms right now are talking about being affected by tariffs. If you look at export controls, you find a massive resurgence in the use. Now, the orange line is US export controls towards China and is largely semiconductors. But you can see at the very end of the graph, which actually we need to keep updating, there's a green area that opens up. That's American firms talking about export controls from China on rare earths affecting them. You can go a lot deeper. You can say, okay, let me look at when the US is the imposing country and when the target is China, which sectors are they using to exert the pressure? And you can see that in the US case, the overwhelming majority is semiconductors. When China retaliates on the US, the vast majority is coming from metals and minerals. And that's essentially the rare earths. And you can keep going down to the firm level. So let me show you a few more one. I mentioned this nonlinearity of power. So let's look at that formula again and make it more fun. Before I argued informally that if you look at power, it's coming from the little omega getting close to one or the elasticity of substitutions getting close to one. And here I'm just plotting that graph. I'm plotting the theoretical formula. Now take all of the bilateral trade data of the Western Alliance compared to China and populate this graph. Okay, the elasticities, I take them from a paper from Fontaine. I mean, they're doing their best. There's certainly a lot of noise. This data is also noisy, but you can see, where in that region the relationship of the West to China lies. Okay, that's all our data. Now bring in the LLMs and tell me for each one of these sectors, each one of these dots is a share of a sector and the elasticity of that sector in the relationship of the West towards China. Now let's ask ourselves, which sectors talk the most about being used in export controls towards China? You can use the AI outcomes. So a big red ball means that sector is being used a tremendous amount, very frequently, in imposing export controls towards China. So if the theory is correct, if what the US is doing is using sectors for which he has a lot of power, he would be using all of the sectors that are in the very nonlinear part of that graph. That's what an economist calls a choke point. It's a sector that can do a lot of damage. If this was nonsense, this would be all over the place. And you can see that it's a bit of both. There are, in general, the sectors that get used the most tend to be sectors where the US is or the Western Alliance is dominant and potentially have relatively low elasticity of substitutions. But there's a lot of hit and miss. I'll tell you some misses that are interesting. Autos. The Western Alliance has a dominant share of exports to China, but it doesn't really get used. In part, as it might be, we don't want to damage that sector. There are some sectors like soybeans. There are things that we might be reluctant to use because it damages the domestic firms a lot, or we have no interest in shrinking that sector in China. There is also, a lot of noise in the data, so you could imagine that if what matters is the exact semiconductor, if there's a huge difference between the very advanced one and the less advanced one, at the level at which we're aggregating the data, we're totally missing that point. And so the choke points might be farther down. But it gives you, the point that we're trying to make, this is very provisional work, I finished this literally yesterday, is it gives you a structured way to think about this. It says you can no longer say strategic and that's it. You have to bring it to a date and you have to tell me it's because we have a dominant position, there's a low elasticity of substitution, it might be affecting China this way. I promised you at the beginning that a lot of what we wanted to do was make things sufficiently formal that you could take them to the data and see what works and what doesn't. And hopefully I'm delivering at least in part on this promise. And we would like to do a lot more of this. This is still very, very imperfect. You can also look at how firms react. So this is kind of fun, and then we'll leave it here. So let me start on the left. These are the countries imposing the policies. So let me look at tariffs. So think of those blue lines are the US is imposing tariffs on its domestic firms. What are the big reaction? Prices. Firms report facing much higher input prices, and they report increasing their own prices. So they're passing it through somewhat. Very little evidence of big employment effects, big investment effects. Domestic investment doesn't really move very much. Now, look on the right-hand side. Firms in countries that are receiving the pressure. First, for tariffs, relatively little evidence that they're cutting prices. But for export controls, there is a massive pattern. You can see those big green bars on the right-hand side of the screen. Those are the Chinese firms reporting that in response to American export controls on semiconductors, they're doing a lot of investment. It's largely domestic investment, and they're spending a lot of money in R&D. That's a little bit of the kind of model that we have coming alive. If you lose that variety because the hegemon is preventing you from using it, what do? You scale up the domestic sector. You try to generate a domestic alternative. This doesn't say how good it is or how successful it is, but it tells you what the reaction is going on. If you go back to the trade war, one of the things that you can ask is the firm positively or negatively affected? Now you can see that these are American firms. 50% of the firm report being negatively affected by the tariffs. There are some firms in the data, about 10%, that report being positively affected. And it's kind of interesting to see who they are, because if you're a trade theorist, they're kind of like a great way to visualize the domestic producer subsidy component of a tariff. So we took the US firms, we split them into the ones that report being positively affected, that's the light blue, and the ones that report being negatively affected, that's the dark blue from the tariffs. And first, you can see that it immediately corresponds to the profit margin. So they're thinking of positive and negative in terms of profits, which is very natural. But to me, the most telling is what's happening at the other end of the graph. The firms that are reported being negatively affected are much more likely to report facing higher input prices, but about equally as likely to be able to report higher sales prices. The firms that are being positively affected are about equally likely to report an increase in price, but much less likely to report an increase in inputs. So what's happening is that those are the firms whose competitors are raising prices because they're affected by the tariffs. They themselves are not affected by the tariffs, but they can increase prices because their competitors are increasing prices, hence increasing markups and profits. So that's exactly what a trade theory would give you for the producer subsidy component of a tariff. Okay, let me stop here because we're well at time. Let me just say, look, I cannot think of a more pressing set of global challenges than this. I mean, I wake up every day and I'm just ecstatic in some sense intellectually dealing with this problem. Now, it's a bad problem for the world that would like to have nothing to do. But as economists, we have so much that we can add to this debate. And as I argued at the very beginning, as a field, we've actually not been very active in this space. I think political scientists have really taken the lead and have done great work in this space. But there are things that we can add, and I think we should. So these are things that are at least on my mind. We're working on a model of multiple hegemons. We're working on things where there's a much bigger domestic political economy. What is the duality between all of these economic threats and the military? Similarly, I showed you why I'm excited about the data. Once you have formal models, you can take them to the data. You can do structural models. You can do sufficient statistics. You can do potentially using LLMs and try to go causal. We need a lot of evidence. We need to start disciplining the debate on what's big, what's small. We also need quantity counterfactual. So the way I think about this, it's an analogy with macroprudential policy. Like immediately after the financial crisis, you get the crazy camps. You get the the government should make every loan in the economy, or we just go pure free markets, finance is always perfect. Eventually, what did we do? We did applied theory and measurement that says, look, there's a few pecuniary externalities, a few issues of moral hazard that we have to think about carefully, and we try to shrink the debate in the middle, clarifying what is the second best policy, what is the role for government intervention. And if we're successful in this agenda, I hope to do the same for geoeconomics. I mean, right now there is the sort of bullying all the time like crazy, which should be the far west, or this power doesn't even exist. It's all free market and you get the best possible outcomes. I think we need to go and bring this in the middle and think a lot harder about what are the sources of inefficiency. Not all exertions of power are bad. How do we shape the economies to make them resilient without giving up a ton of the gains from trade? Under which circumstances is there a role for government intervention? And what do you want to leave to the private sector to make their own decisions in supply chains? That's where I think as a profession, we're very good. And certainly, my co-authors and I are very interested in this. I will leave you with all of the promised references. If you want to get involved in this space, I hope that you will find some of these references helpful. They certainly took us a lot of time to get deeper into this literature, and I'm hopeful that we can make it faster for other people that would like to start contributing. So thank you, and I'm happy to take all the questions.